Welcome back. In recent months, former CIA Director John Brennan has become an increasingly vocal critic of members of Congress who have attacked the intelligence community. For instance, on Thursday, one day before the release of the Republican memo, Brennan sent out a tweet that said, in part, "I never witnessed the type of reckless partisan behavior I am now seeing from Nunes and House Republicans. Absence of moral and ethical leadership in White House is fueling this government crisis." Well, joining me now is the former CIA Director himself under President Obama, John Brennan, who is making his debut as an NBC News senior national security and intelligence analyst. Mr. Brennan, welcome to NBC and welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good to be here.
Let me start with the Nunes memo. We know that the FBI is an agency that made the application of FISA that the CIA was not involved. But you ran the interagency task force out of the CIA beginning in summer 16, included the FBI as concerns were rising about this Russian interference. What can you say about what you believe the evidence that the FBI had to get that FISA warrant, and how much of the Steele dossier was a part of it?
Well, we, the CIA and the intelligence community, had collected a fair amount of information in the summer of 2016 about what the Russians were doing on multiple fronts. And we want to make sure that the FBI had full access to that.
Is the Papadopoulos thing come through the CIA via the Five Eyes thing? That would have been the piece of information that gets to the FBI? Is that how that works?
No, I'm not going to get into details about how it was acquired, but the FBI has very close relationship with its British counterparts. Okay. And so the FBI had visibility into a number of things that were going on, involving some individuals who may have had some affiliation with the Trump campaign. Mm-hmm. And so the intelligence that we collected was pulsed against that. And I thought it would have been derelict if the FBI did not pull the threads, investigative threads, on American persons who might have been involved with Russia and working on their behalf either wittingly or unwittingly.
You've said wittingly and unwittingly a lot. How much of this do you believe was unwitting?
I believe that there was a fair amount of naivete on the part of individuals who were part of the Trump campaign. Individuals who maybe were unaware of what their obligations were, or just how diabolical the Russians can be in terms of their cultivation of individuals to work on their behalf.
So the Trump Tower meeting, for instance, with Donald Trump Jr., gets an email. We now found out he thinks it's Hillary Clinton dirt. If it's what I think it is, it's great. He takes this meeting with the Russians. Is that you look at something like that, is that witting or unwitting in your mind?
I find it foolish, number one, and also irresponsible. If senior members of a political campaign and a presidential campaign, they need to be aware of what it is that they need to do in order to make sure that they stay on the right side of the law as well as the right side of ethics. And I find it inexplicable in terms of how that meeting took place, and interest in part of individuals very close to Mr. Trump who wanted to get dirt on Hillary Clinton from Russians.
When did you first learn of the so-called Steele dossier and what Christopher Steele was doing?
Well, it was not a very well-kept secret among press circles for several months before it came out. And it was in late summer of 2016 when there were some individuals from the various U.S. news outlets who asked me about my familiarity with it. And I had heard just snippets about it. I did not know what was in there. I did not see it until later in that year. I think it was in December. But I was unaware of the provenance of it as well as what was in it. And it did not play any role whatsoever in the intelligence community assessment that was done, that was presented to then President Obama and then President-elect Trump.
How was the Steele dossier treated? How did you treat it? You said you looked at it in December. I assume it's been looked at it was obviously looked at by the FBI. We've now learned they've tried to confirm some of it and have had some success. Some not yet. They say it's unconfirmed, but that's about it.
Well, there were things in that dossier that made me wonder whether or not they were in fact accurate and true. And I do think it was up to the FBI to see whether or not they could verify any of it. I think Jim Comey has said that it contained salacious and unverified information. Just because it was unverified didn't mean it wasn't true. And if the Russians were involved in something like that, directed against individuals who are aspiring to the highest office in this land, there was an obligation on the part of the FBI to seek out the truth on it.
I want to go to the central thesis of the Nunes memo is that the FISA court was misled about the origins of the Steele dossier, misled about political bias. We are learning that the FISA court was certainly alerted of some political opponent being involved in this. How much detail should the FISA judge have known, and should they have known more than they did?
Well, it's so hard to say because we don't have access to the underlying information of the Nunes memo, which really, clearly indicates that he was being exceptionally partisan in this. And as I said in my tweet, I've had fights with the Dems over the years when I was in the Obama administration, to include on the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on the interrogation program the CIA ran. But I never, ever saw the Democrats do something like this that was so partisan, so reckless, and really just laid waste to the protocols that govern committees. And Devin Nunes, over the past several months, all the way back to the spring of last year, I think has been engaged in these tactics purely to defend, make excuses, and try to protect Mr. Trump.
You were pretty rough on the Senate Intel Committee when they released the so-called torture report. Compare the two.
Dianne Feinstein and I had some very, very confrontational.
You went on this show and had some, I think, said some tough things on it.
And I thought it was a partisan, one-sided report, but yet Senator Feinstein kept the Republican members informed and did not decide to put something out that only reflected the Democratic side. The fact that Devin Nunes and Republicans denied the ability of the minority, the Democratic members of that committee, to put out its report is just appalling. And I think it really underscores just how partisan Mr. Nunes has been. He has abused the office of the chairmanship of HPSCI. And I don't say that lightly. I think over the past year, he has demonstrated he's engaged in these tactics purely to defend and try to make excuses.
Has he brought up any legitimate issue in your mind in that memo?
If there are issues related to the process involving FISA, and if there are concerns about how forthcoming the Bureau is, and I think the Bureau, from what I've been able to tell, was very forthcoming. This was a renewal of FISA. But if he had concerns about that, he could have hearings. He could bring in the members of the FBI and others, and to really seek what is, needs to be done differently. But he didn't do that. He just put out publicly one side and a very selective, cherry-picked memo.
I want to get your reaction to something your successor said about his decision-making process as head of the CIA. Here it is.
Government's worse than the private sector because the incentive systems are misaligned. And so I led by example. 40% of the decisions that were previously made by the director of the CIA no longer are made by me. You might say, wow, that's reckless. I would tell you it was reckless to do it the other way.
I think there are a number of senior members of this administration who follow Donald Trump's way of trying to denigrate and condemn everything that happened before them as a way to make them appear that they are doing things better than ever happened previously. And so I don't want to, address, what my successor says. I don't agree with some of the things that he has said. But I think it reflects a general insecurity that only if you criticize your predecessors, whether it be President Obama or whether it be the former director of CIA, are you able to make sort of points to try to trump up your credentials.
Republican opponents of you claimed you were politicizing the CIA. There's some Democratic opponents of Mike Pompeo that believe he's politicizing the CIA. What do you hear from rank and file?
I am so confident that the rank and file of the CIA are going to continue to do their mission. And they have been used to this before. This partisan sniping, unfortunately, the rancor right now in Washington between the Democrats and Republicans is at an unprecedented level. And the ones I'm concerned about are the families of CIA officers and FBI agents. They're the ones who sacrifice on behalf of their loved ones. And to hear people like Mr. Trump and others denigrate the work that they do, and they're trying to make distinctions between the rank and file and the senior members, well, I think, CIA officers and FBI officers know that these are institutions that I believe have been well led over the years and that really are so important and critical to keep this nation safe and secure. So I just am appalled by the things that are being said.
John Brennan, you're now adding the title of NBC News National Security Analyst, Senior National Security Analyst. Welcome aboard. Thanks for being on Meet the Press.
Thank you, Chuck.
Appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.